Brought to you by Connect.js, Atlanta's premier JavaScript conference. Sponsored in part by FeatherDirect. Need a mobile app? Contact us for your custom mobile solution.
For those who missed the announcement, this room is now the Angular Bootcamp talk. If you're looking for the other talk, whatever that was, it's in Ballroom A. Everyone here for Angular then? Yes? Excellent. Now I realize the description on the website was a little vague, and that is completely my fault. So I apologize for that up front. The idea behind this talk is that it is a show and tell. What we are going to do is we are going to write out a simple Angular application, stepping our way through all, I shouldn't say all, but many of the features that I believe make Angular a very, very good choice for your next project. The code that I'm going to show you is available here. So you can download it, clone it, play with it, do whatever you want with it. All the code I show you today is there. Every step along the way is a separate commit. You want to look at the solutions branch. This is a Git repository. Check out the solutions branch, and everything I show you today will be in that branch. With that said, allow me to introduce myself. I am Raju. I am here from Columbus, Ohio, and I am loosely typed on Twitter. So you can tweet nice things about me, or bad things. That's okay. All right, now before I get started, that cannot be good. Before I get started, a show of hands. How many of you have used some kind of JavaScript MVC framework for a project? Raise your hands. Wow, very nice. Shout out a few names for me. What have people used? You raised your hand. You've used Angular. Okay. This might not be the room for you. Are you sure you want to be here? Sencha Touch. Okay. Anyone else? I'm sorry. So we have some Ember folks in the room. Any Backbone? Any Knockout? Okay, all right. Well, I can't list all the names. I think if you took the dictionary, put it up against the wall, threw a dot at it, and put the extension .js, there's probably a JavaScript framework with that name out there somewhere, right? Now, what we are going to do today is we're going to play with some code. Can everyone see the font on that screen, especially the people in the back? Is that big enough? Thumbs up? Excellent. What I have here is a Java project. Now, I don't know if all of you are Java programmers or have done anything, so let me explain the layout. I have the root directory. Underneath that, I have a resources folder, a public folder, some CSS files, which we don't care about. I have pulled in AngularJS and a few other files. I will talk about the jQuery in just 1 minute, but I have Angular pulled in. And what I have down here is home.html. Down below, what you see is essentially Java source code for the backend, essentially a RESTful backend endpoint. How many people have done Clojure in the room? Any Clojure folks in the room? All right, very nice. This is Clojure code. You don't have to worry about it. You can have any endpoint. If you're a Rails shop, well, thank you for that alert. Anywho, so that's the structure. We have a RESTful endpoint, JavaScript, HTML, CSS on the front end. What I have open in the browser is that file, but if you pay close attention, I am currently pulling in the file as is. I am not serving this up via a HTTP server. We will see the HTTP server later in the session, but for now, let's just play with an HTML file. Everyone good? All right, let's take a look at the HTML file. This is HTML5. I've already done the legwork of pulling in AngularJS. I have a file here called main.js, which is currently empty. This is going to be our main JavaScript file for today. I have a body tag. I should probably get rid of this. I have a body tag, couple of divititis. Has anyone heard the expression divititis? Too many divs is what happens when you get divititis. Right? It is a condition. If you are an HTML developer, you might be afflicted. I suggest you get yourself checked. Now, at the end of this, I have jQuery pulled in. For an Angular project, you do not need jQuery. The reason I have jQuery pulled in is because I'm using Bootstrap, which is the Twitter Bootstrap CSS framework. That has a dependency on jQuery, right? So you don't need jQuery for your Angular projects. This is merely a dependency, incidental dependency for my project. All right, now, the first half of this talk is going to be about introductions. We're going to talk about Angular, we're going to talk about the data binding model, we're going to talk about controllers, scoping rules, we're going to talk about how to do form submissions, validations, and we will end, hopefully, if time permits, with filters. If time does not permit, the next session will start with filters, factory services, we will talk about AJAX, we'll talk about routing, and then we'll finally see how to do HTTP AJAX requests over the wire. Everyone good with the agenda? Any questions about what you're going to see in this session? Can I get started after all this introduction? All right. Now, how many people have done jQuery in the room? Any jQuery users? Everybody should raise their hands. At some point, you have touched jQuery, right? It is the most prolific, probably the most prolific JavaScript library out there. Let me ask you this. What is the first thing you do when you have to use jQuery in your project? What is the first thing you have to do?
Select.
Before that? Download it. Right? It's not going to show up on its own, right? You got to download it, put it somewhere, make it a dependency on your project. We have already done that for Angular, right? We already pulled it down, we've already included it. Step number 1 off the list. What's step number 2 when you use jQuery? Select is actually step number 3. You're one step before that. $document.ready, you have to bootstrap jQuery, right? You have to wake it up and tell it, here, do some work for me, right? Angular needs a similar bootstrapping process, and the way Angular works is Angular is essentially a directives-based framework. We'll talk about directives all day today for what it's worth. But the way you think about a directive, for now, for the next 2 hours, when you think about a directive, this is what you should hear when I use the word directive. It is something that teaches your browser new tricks. That's how you think of a directive. It's something that teaches your browser new tricks. Now, in order to load Angular into my project, I use something called ng-app. ng-app stands for Angular app, and this is essentially what will wake up Angular when this document gets loaded by the browser. Is everyone okay with this? It looks like a CSS attribute. It's a data attribute in the HTML5 model, essentially. This is a key value pair, but for now, let's just use the key, since HTML gives us that permission. Now, with this loaded, I'm going to go and refresh the page, and voila! Isn't that awesome? Go on, tell me it's not awesome. All right, well, this was a great introduction to Angular. Thank you all for coming in. Enjoy the rest. I'm just kidding. Nothing happened, right? Why didn't anything happen? If I just said $document.ready empty callback, what would jQuery do? Wake up, go back to sleep, done. That is what we did. We woke up Angular, Angular looked around and said, there's nothing for me to do. I'm going to go back to sleep. Nothing to do, nothing changes on the page. Though one thing did change that's not visible to us is Angular woke up and went back to sleep. The other thing you need to keep in mind is Angular is very specific about which portion of the page it operates in. Think of this highlighted portion as the surface area of this Angular application, in the sense that Angular is only active between the open body tag and the close body tag. You can move this directive down to a div. So let's do that. I'm going to move it down here. And now the surface area of our Angular application is only between the open and the closed div tags. This is something that is extremely useful because your entire application may not be managed by Angular, right? You might have some sort of a workflow inside your main application that steps the user through registration, or steps the user through credit card information, or what have you. You want the rest of the application to be managed by something else. Maybe it's the server, maybe it's jQuery, maybe it's Backbone, whatever. Angular promises that with the outside of the highlighted portion, Angular will not do anything. It will not pollute the namespace. Now, that's not to say that other frameworks will not pollute Angular's namespace, but there's nothing Angular can do about that, right? The point here is there is a surface area for Angular applications, and it is between the open, close, ng app tags. Everyone good? Now, the first thing I usually like to do is to use something called a evaluation directive just to make sure everything is wired up correctly. So what I'm going to do is put an h3 over here, and then I'm going to do curly curly bracket, curly curly bracket. This is an evaluation directive. What that means is that Angular will take whatever's inside those curly curly brackets and evaluate it in the current scope. Now I'm going to use this phrase a lot today, in the current scope, and we will keep delving into what this scope business is all about. The takeaway from this section, you understand how scope works, you understand how Angular works. That is the key to mastery in Angular. In our case, we're going to start with something very trivial. I'm just going to do 2 plus 3 just to make sure everything is wired up correctly. Refresh the page and I see 5. Raise the roof, woot woot. The good news is everything is wired up, right? So we're good. Let's do something a little bit more elaborate. What I'm going to show you here is some jQuery code. Let me paste it here. That way you can see what I'm talking about. What I want to do, let's say your boss comes to you and says, this is your requirement. I have an input box, and whatever the user types into the input box, you need to display down here. So I have an input box, an h3 tag. Whatever the user types in the first input box should be displayed in the h3 tag down below. How would you do this using jQuery? Well, I've already done the legwork for you. Here's what you would do. You would say, hey, in some JavaScript file somewhere, you would say, hey, jQuery, select this element, get its value, stuff it in some variable, and then select the h3 tag, set its HTML to first name. Does this make sense to everyone? What are you doing here? What you're doing is model view binding, right? You have a view component, you have an input box, you have another view component, which is an h3 tag, and you want those two to be bound, to be driven by some model. That model is first name. Now you might be a very careful JavaScript programmer and say, this is probably not a good idea. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say var user is an empty object, and then I'm going to say user dot first name is this property, and then user dot first name set the value of the h3 tag. What are we doing again? User is our model, and we're driving the input, the input is driving the user's first name, and in turn, the user's first name is driving the h3 tag. Everyone good? Let's see how we would do something like this in Angular. Get rid of that, because we don't need it. We don't need, you can have the ID tags. I'm going to get the ID tags out because it's just noise. And take all of this out. What I'm going to say is, hey, Angular, please create me a model to back this input box. And I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it first name, just like we did earlier. And here what I want is the value of first name evaluated. And we just saw the evaluation directive, so I'm going to use that guy. I'm going to say evaluation directive first name. Please evaluate this variable in the current scope. We'll talk about the scope in a few minutes. Is everyone comfortable with what's going on here? I realize it's a little abstract, but does it kind of make sense? Now, just to prove beyond reasonable doubt that there are no tricks up my sleeve, main.js is still empty, I'm going to refresh the page. And I am going to type. This is the part where you say, ooh. Tell me that's not awesome. Go on. Tough crowd. All right. Well, one man, gentleman in the front is not impressed with this. Right. That's right. This is feature number 1 and probably number 1 selling point for Angular. This is automatic two-way binding between model and view. Please note that we didn't actually create anything called first name. Angular came along at this point, and when it hit this line, it looked around in the current scope. So let me make a small digression here and explain what the scope business is about. I'm going to write some pseudo JavaScript here. This is pseudo, please. This is not real JavaScript, but it should work. When Angular wakes up, it creates an object called root scope. Now, when Angular hit this line of code, it looked at this guy and said, do you have on you a property called first name? That guy said no. So what Angular did is $rootScope.firstName is an empty string. Why do I say it's an empty string? Because the input type text. Very good. If that was an input type checkbox, Angular would default the value to be a false, which is a default Boolean false in JavaScript. Now, when it hit this line of code, it said, is there anything called first name in the current scope? Oh yes, there is. Take his value and stick it in here. That's why the first time when we do this, this is blank. I can initialize this value with something called ng-init. And I can say first name is Raju. And now if I refresh the page, Raju just shows up, right? Now, I could have done, let me remove that initialization because it's too much. I could have done something like this, user.firstName, because that is what a good JavaScript developer would do. You would have this notion of a model and tack on properties on top. If you did this, Angular would first do something like this. And then take this guy. And now what you have is a user object with a first name property. And everything, hopefully if I didn't break anything, should still work. Let's type again, JSON, and everything still works. So whenever you're working in Angular, you're always working within some scope. Right now, what you're working on is the root scope. Think of the root scope as a global variable within your Angular application, right? With that said, I personally am a huge fan of global variables. I think this whole private business is being taken too far. put everything in global scope, and there's no reason to hide anything, right? Everybody shares promiscuously, right? I think half the bugs that show up in our code are because of this whole private business, right? Just make everything public, everything global, we will be in a much better place. How many of you agree with this notion? How many of you are big fans of global variables? That's right. He sees what I see. He is seeing the big picture here. Here's the problem. Here's the problem with mine and, of course, your thinking process. I am going to say first time, second time, refresh the page. Now I get 2 input boxes. Can anyone take a guess as to what will happen if I start typing here? I'm sorry, what? All 4 change, very good. What happens if I type here? Same thing, right? The problem with the global property is that there's one root scope object in your entire application. It has now one property on it called first name that is being shared by both the input boxes. Now, despite my notion and love for global variables, you can see how this may be a problem, right? You could have user registration up here in your application. You could have account information down here. If they both happen to have a variable called first name, one clobbers the other. What we want, what we need, is not to stuff everything in here. What if we could do something like this? Only for this first guy, right? Only for the first guy, we create root scope dot dollar scope is an empty object. Let's call that scope 1. And then for the second guy, I create scope 2. Now the problem goes away, right? Everything is still tacked onto the root scope, but each of those input boxes have their own scope object. And now you can have first name on both and they don't clash with each other. Does that make sense? How do we do this? In Angular, we use controllers for this. One of the role of a controller is to introduce scope, to introduce nested scopes inside the big parent scope. So essentially, we replicate this behavior by using controllers. It's one reason why you use controllers in Angular. Let us declare our first controller. I think I've made my point about global variables, so I'm going to get rid of all of this. Oops, too much. Okay, let's simplify this. It's just too much text. Get rid of the user, get rid of this. Let us declare our first controller. I'm going to go to main.js, and I'm going to say function first controller. Ignore this for 1 minute, just bear with me. I'm going to copy paste this name and I'm going to say, this is our ng app, so this is the surface area of our application. I'm going to say ng controller. So for this portion of the application, please create me a controller. That controller's implementation is called first controller. And we've just declared and used our first controller. Does everything work? Yes. Now, before we get into the details, can anyone see anything special about this controller? Other than the dollar scope name, I understand that. But outside of that, can anyone see anything special about this controller?
Yes.
What is that?
Normally you would put it in the namespace.
Well, that's something wrong with it. My question was more, is there anything special about it in the sense, that's just a regular JavaScript function, right? Which means, if I need to test this function, how do I test it? I test it just like a regular JavaScript function. Normally, in most of the frameworks that you might have used, what do you have to do to get a controller, get a model? What do you have to do? Extend. Maybe your framework says you have to extend the base model to get the notion of a model. You have to extend a controller to get the notion of a controller. This is a full-blown Angular controller that has no extensions, which means you test it just like a JavaScript function. This is cell point number 2, and in fact, this is probably as big as a two-way binding. Everything about Angular is built, designed, thought out from the ground up to make testing easier. That's the very premise behind this. Everything. In fact, coming out of the Angular project, there is a test runner project called Karma, which was previously called Testacular. You can probably tell why they changed the name. And now they have their own testing framework called Protractor, which is specifically designed for testing Angular applications. Everything in the Angular team is about testing. If you can't test it, rethink, redesign it. Right? Now, what's this $scope business about? Well, remember that what we want is we want a nested scope under the root scope. Right? That's what we want. What I'm asking Angular to do over here is I'm saying this controller has a dependency. One of those dependencies is a scope object. So basically, when Angular hits that line of code, Angular says, oh, one of the dependencies for your controller is a scope object. I am going to create a scope object, attach it to the root scope, and inject it into your controller for you. Does that make sense? This is dependency injection. How many people have done dependency injection outside of this, Spring or .NET or what have you? Number one selling point for DI, testability, right? You can mock out the scope object, pass it anything you want, and test the scope object to say, do you have this behavior? Do you do this when I invoke this on you, right? Mocking, stubbing, testing, all much easier. This is dependency injection in Angular. And you can use DI in any function in Angular. That's the nice thing. Anywhere you have a dependency, you can use it. Now, earlier you saw me do something which was ng-init, which is initialize the model with some value. What I'm going to do here is on the scope object, I am going to tack on a property called first name and set its value to Raju. Now please note that this first name is being used here and here. Let's go back and see what's happening. This field will be evaluated in the current scope. What is the current scope right now? The $scope that got injected into the controller, which is attached to the root scope. So it's $root_scope.$scope.firstname. And if I refresh the page, everything still works exactly the way you saw it earlier. Does this make sense to everyone? How's everyone doing? Any questions? All right. Oh, forgive me. Yes, sir.
The dollar scope
Yes, sir.
is required to be dollar scope. It can't be anything else, right?
It's a good question. The question the gentleman has is, does this name need to be $scope? And the answer is yes. If I typo this, bad things happen. That is a trademark, by the way, and I own the trademark. Bad things happen, right? Because it's just like any other DI framework. I want that bean to be injected into me. The name has to be looked up by the framework. But you do bring up an interesting point. Earlier, you pointed out that this function is in global scope, right? It's problem number one. Does anyone see a problem with $scope having to be called $scope all the time? Minification, right? When you minify your code, the minifier comes along and says, this is 6 characters, and that is way too much. I'm going to make him 8. This is a very appropriate time for using the pretext, it works on my machine. I don't care about production. because it will work on your machine. Production is going to topple over because most likely you're not minifying your code and writing development code. Because if you are, you're kind of missing out. It is much more painful to do minified code and write code against it. So, with that said, how do we fix this problem? Well, Angular gives us an alternative way to declare a controller. In order to do that, we have to first start by creating a module, essentially a glorified namespace. Just think of it that way. And the reason they have this infrastructure is because JavaScript has no notion of packages, modules. There's no namespacing built into JavaScript, the language. So we create a module, we say, hey, Angular, please give me a module, when we are going to call it to-dos app, because that's what we're going to write today. And ignore the square brackets at the end for now. Just bear in mind that those are important. If you forget the square brackets, bad things happen, right? So I'm saying, please give me a namespace. I'm going to hold on to that namespace in some variable called app. Then I'm going to say, hey app, please create me a controller whose name is first controller. Please note the name is in strings. Followed, the controller takes two arguments. The first is a name. The second is an array. The last item in the array is the implementation of the controller. 1 to n minus 1 are all the dependencies for that controller in string format. So I'm going to say $scope. And now when Angular initializes this controller, it says, what are your dependencies? Oh, this is $scope. I'm going to create a new scope object, wire it up correctly, and inject it as the first argument in this function. If I had more than one, let's say we had an HTTP, which is the $Ajax of Angular, then you just do that, and then you give it a name. And so now Angular will inject scope as the first argument, HTTP as the second argument. Since they are being injected in the order that I have declared them, I can now call this S and H. I can now call this S. And if one more thing, since I do have a namespace here, I have to tell my application up here that your namespace is called to-dos app. So everything will be looked up in that namespace. And if I refresh the page, uh-oh, I broke something. Oh, I need the $sign here. Actually, I don't know why I'm doing that. We don't need HTTP right now, so we should be okay. So this is Raju, and everything works. Now, this variable name doesn't matter because this is in string format. So let us see if we've solved our two problems. Problem number one was global scope. Where's this function now? It's an anonymous function inside an array. Global scope problem solved. What second problem was minification. If the minifier comes along, will it minify a string? No. We are good. Problem solved. Now, you brought the very appropriate question, so thank you for that. But outside of that, the reason why I like to show this syntax is because every JavaScript application out there is an open source application, right? Go to any page, right click, view source, you're there, which is what you are going to do when you go home, right? Someone's going to come to you and say, this application was written in Angular, and you're like, man, how did they do this thing? What are you going to do? Right click, view source, and boom, you are there. You are going to see this syntax for controllers. So if you don't know the syntax, you're going to wonder, I just attended a 2-hour session at Connect.js, and I wasted 2 hours of my life that I'm never going to get back. So for complete disclosure, this is the way you should declare your controllers. Outside of the fact that it works on my machine pretext is not a very good one. How's everyone doing? Good? Any questions so far? Excellent. now that we have this, let's do something a little bit more exciting. Oh, too much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create what to do's. And I'm going to create an object, text. Let's do learn Angular. And copy, paste, paste. Speak about it. Profit. Woot! All right. So we have an array of 3 objects, to-dos. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tag this on the scope. Let's call this scope. S is a little too indecipherable for me. And scope dot to-dos is to-dos. What am I doing here? I have the to-dos array, and I'm setting a property on the scope object called to-dos. Now, given your understanding so far, how do I get to the to-dos over here? Don't get ahead of yourself. All I have to do here is what? To-dos, right? Let's refresh the page. Voila, look at that. I say it's good enough, ship it. It's a to-dos app. No one told me about unordered lists. You might not be impressed, right? If you're going to lay to-dos out on a page, what would you normally do, right? Depending on your perspective on to-dos, there might be unordered lists or ordered lists, right? So let's take a look at that. How do I do ordered lists or unordered lists now that I have a collection of objects, right? Which is a very common problem. What I'm going to do is, okay, so we have unordered list item. The way you iterate over a collection is you use yet another directive called ngRepeat. And ngRepeat basically says for every some variable in some collection, do some work. Does that make sense to everyone? T is just some variable. It just gets created for every nth item in the array. What do I want to do here? Now I could put T, or I could put T.text. Where do I get text from? This property. Let's take a look. Look at that. Thank you. I'm here all day. I say ship it. Sounds good to me. What's missing? Add new to-dos would be a good idea. Checkbox would be a good idea. I mean, I've learned Angular, I've spoken about it. Hopefully I'll profit today, right? My next to-do should be retired. Right, I'm done, right? Let us checkbox it, and then we'll add new to-dos. We know we are looping, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put, oops, checkbox, text. Oh, check. Oh, come on, checkbox. Really? All right, we have an input type checkbox. Now, when I check the checkbox, what do you wish to be done? Well, that'd be one, but you have to store that value somewhere, right? The model has to get updated. What I'm going to do over here, the strike through would be nice for what it's worth, but I'm going to say on an ng change, when the checkbox value changes, yet another directive. When the checkbox value changes, what do we want to do? We want to take the current to-do, and set on it some property that says you're done, right? What happens if I do something like this? Now, just for grins, I am going to do down here, I'm going to put an H4, and I'm going to display all the to-dos in JSON format. And we'll see what this means in a few minutes. For now, just see that ng, what am I screwing? Input type checkbox. ng checked. Oh, ng click. ng click. Oh, God. What did I mess up over here? I broke something. Give me 1 second, guys. Sorry about that. ng change. Oh, crap. Sorry, wrong window.
We should have the ng change too.
Oh yes, so it is ng change. I'm sorry. On ng change, set t. Well, yeah, but ng change should fire that. Oh yes, I'm sorry. D dot done. I'm sorry, my apologies. Let's just start here, take a step back. I'm going to set the model of the checkbox to be t dot done. Now, what will that do? Earlier we had first name for an input type text, right? When I started typing in the input box, what happened? Angular looked around, said, is there a first name property? If not, I'm going to create one for you and set its value to whatever the value of the input box is. Here I'm saying your model is some property on the current t. What's the current t? The current to do. If I change the value of, and I'm not sure if all of you can see this, you see it creates the property on that object, sets its value to done. So my apologies for that confusion. Does that make sense to everyone? Yes, sir. That's a good question, actually. The question is, if I uncheck it, does it remove it? And no. The answer is now it will just set it to false. All right. How's everyone doing? Does that make sense? Now, of course, you may have that requirement. If I uncheck it, I don't want that property, right? Or you might have a slightly different requirement. Is not only when I uncheck it should the property go away, I don't want that property to be a Boolean value. I want it to be something else, right? We are programmers. We are the masters of overloading, right? If we can overload a variable, we will. So what if we made it a timestamp? What if we said that the done property is not a Boolean value? If the property exists, it has a timestamp against it, which tells us A, it's done, B, when it was done. And maybe we could sort or hide and do whatever we want with that timestamp, right? How do we do that? Well, this won't work because t.done will always be a Boolean because that's the very nature of checkboxes. So what I want to do is create some random property called done for now, which will get created because Angular will look around and say there is no done property around. So I'm going to create one for you. What I'm going to say is when the checkbox changes, please invoke a function called markDone. And what markDone should do, apologize for that, what markDone should do is take the current to do, take the value of the checkbox. If the checkbox is true, set the timestamp. If the checkbox is false, delete the timestamp. Does that make sense? Now, given your understanding so far, where will Angular go looking for the markDone function? What was that again? Scope. On the current scope. Always the current scope. Right? A lot of my sessions I give people affirmations. People know what affirmations are? When you wake up tomorrow morning, you're going to tell yourself 3 times. Everything in Angular happens on the current scope. Right? After your lunch break, you're going to tell yourself 3 times. Everything happens on the current scope. And then finally, just before you go to sleep at night, 3 times, everything happens on the current scope. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, on the scope object, please create me a function. Did I call it markDone? Yeah. Create me a function. Let's hash out the function and we'll see how to fill in the big parts. So what did I say? I said if the checkbox is checked, so some Boolean value gets passed in. If the checkbox is checked, then take the current TD to do, set the done property to the current timestamp. Now the gentleman at the back said if I uncheck it, I want to delete the property. So let's do that. Delete t dot done. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, like good programmers, we're going to pass in the values of C and T. I need to pass in something to this function. What is the current checked value of the checkbox? Done. What is the current to do? All right, now after the fiasco we had 5 minutes ago, let's hope that nothing broke. Okay, so far no errors. I'm going to check the box. And we get done timestamp. And if I uncheck it, it gets deleted. Thank you. That's right, raise the roof, baby. This is how you dip into business logic. This is how, if you have to reach outside what Angular does by default, you can do. All you have to understand is if it is on the current scope, Angular can find it. Now, don't get me wrong, you can put stuff on the controller itself, because you do have a controller object in scope, but that's a separate use case. Just for now, bear in mind, you can put stuff on the scope and Angular will find it. With that said, there is one small catch here. Oops, my apologies. What I'm going to do is I'm going to check this box. I'm going to just copy this timestamp. Let's assume, for discussion's sake, that this came from the server, right? This array came from the server, and hopefully, coming on stage today, this was true. Hopefully. I know something about Angular before standing up in front of you, right? With that said, here's the problem. If I refresh the page, notice that the done property is set, but he is not checked. And the reason for that is this. His backing guy is some property called done. What's done initially? False. Right? Angular wakes up, looks at that property, says, oh, no one exists like that. I'm going to create a random property called done, set him to false. What we want to tell Angular is for the first time, and only the first time, set the selected value of that checkbox to be driven by the done property on the to-do. After that, use this done property as the backing bean. Does that make sense? So for that, you can use something called ng selected. hopefully this is, it's ng selected, ng does, checked. I was confused there too. It is ng checked. And there you go. So now it comes in as checked, but after that, if I uncheck it, everything works just as selected. How's everyone doing?
So what does ng checked mean?
ng checked sets the initial value of the checkbox. The first time Angular attaches that checkbox to the DOM, it sets the value of the checkbox based on the value of this property. After that, any interaction with the checkbox will set this model first and then invoke the change function. Does that make sense? They're two orthogonal things, right? What's the initial value versus what happens after that? Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
Any model done, so there's only one done on the scope, and it's just going to change as you click through.
The question is, there is only one done, right? Actually, that's not entirely true. What happens, and again, this goes back to the fact that I should have mentioned this earlier, ng repeat is probably one of the most powerful directives you will use in Angular. What it does is, just like the controller created a nested scope for us, like when we asked for $scope, every iteration of the repeater will create yet another scope. So now you are 3 levels deep without knowing it. You have the root scope guy, who's the global variable. Then you have scope from the controller, and for each loop of the repeater, you have a yet another scope. Each of those scope objects has a done property on it. And because they are 2 separate scope objects, both of them see completely different done values. They can't be just one, because if there's just one, and I checked it, everything gets checked. Right? Are you both asking the same question?
Or done doesn't go down through the scope until it finds, so like, you know, there's a done on the inner scope.
Mm-hmm.
Not done is on the middle scope. So how's it?
So the question is on lookup. Let's say, forget done, but any variable, what is the lookup process? Every scope, I shouldn't take that, let me take that back. Scopes by default inherit prototypely from each other. So root scope is the granddaddy, the $scope for the controller inherits prototypely from root scope. So if it looks for a value on scope and doesn't find it, it will go to the parent. Each of these nested scopes inherit prototypely from this scope. So it's $scope dot nested scope 1, 2, 3. So it looks on each one of them, then goes up, up, up. Does that answer your question? Okay. There was another question.
You had ng check equals t done. Ng check is a boolean to see if the checkbox in the initial stage is checked or not. T done is a timestamp.
So the question is, ng checked, is it a boolean or not? I guess is your question, right? It's truthy or falsy. It's JavaScript. If it's not 0, I guess it'll be well, I think it's a falsy in JavaScript. I can never keep those rules straight, but fundamentally that's the premise. There was a question in the back over there somewhere. Same question. And then there was a question here. Did I miss someone? Oh, okay. Yes, sir.
Should try the checkbox checked or not, right?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Here the model is t.done, right?
The model is done. The only initial value is being set by t.done.
So, but you are setting the check case in the view itself, right? It should be driven by the model.
Correct. So if you think about the wiring over it, the question here essentially is, what's the model here? Is it t.done or is it done? Think about the wiring. There's actually 2 different wirings here. The first time the model is t.done that drives the value of the checkbox. The first time around. The first time the checkbox gets inserted into the DOM, the value is set by this guy. After that, the value is actually stored. The actual model backing this checkbox is this guy. The reason why everything still works is because we then invoke this function that sets the model. But the model's done property is completely different than this done property. It's not the usual where you have one model for both push and pull, right? What you're asking me is how come the checkbox is looking at one value for one and another value for another? Shouldn't it be the same thing? Yeah. Right, it's not. Here, after the first time around, essentially, the value that you are driving is done. The fact that the value of done drives t dot done is something Angular doesn't care about. We wire that up via mark done. Does that make sense? Kinda? Yeah, it's a little confusing, but yeah. Yes, sir.
If you didn't want to use the invoked mark done, could you set your initial ng model to t dot done?
If you didn't want to set what?
If you didn't want to do anything with ng change, could you just leave ng model t dot done?
Yes, which is what we had initially, but you get a Boolean for that. You'd always get a Boolean. Yes, you could, absolutely. And that would answer his query. Is the initial and every value after that is the same Boolean guy. Yes. Yes, sir.
When you set the initial value in the controller, what if you have like a temple keeps changing the initial value to the scope? So the UI reflects that changes?
So the question is, what if that done property was some sort of a updating value in the back end? Will Angular update the UI? The answer is yes. This is active two-way binding. So the model gets updated. There are watchers that are installed on the view. So the view installs a watcher on the model. Anytime the model changes, it propagates an event. The watcher catches it, updates the view. And we'll see that when we do filtering. We will see more of that.
Just go back to the scope real quick, just so I can
Sorry, give me, go back to the scope. Was that your question?
No, I just wanted to hit something.
Yes, sir.
The mark done call makes you feel like you're putting business logic in your display code. Is there a way to take that JavaScript call and put it in the controller, take it out of the template?
Yes, I was actually. The question is, this makes him uncomfortable, right? This, he believes, feels like business logic inside the view, and is there a way to take that out and put it in the controller or somewhere else where it belongs? The thing is, at some point, you have to register a change, right? And I can't think of I can't even think of any way where you can extract it. At this point, because it's a view interaction that's driving everything, it has to be in the view. The one thing to take away from this is if you were looking at this code, even if you knew nothing about Angular, can you kind of tell what will happen if I change the checkbox? Roughly. And that's kind of another Angular's view on things, is they believe that the view should be declarative, in that reading the view should tell me what happens where and how. The thing about a lot of other libraries, especially when people do MVC via jQuery, which is the ad hoc, patch model, is you have this code sitting somewhere over here, you have a view, and there's no way to tell what drives this div to flash or what have you, right? How is everyone doing so far? Oh, give me 1 second. Yes, sir.
Are you able to show the DOM?
Yeah, of course. Which one would you like to see? This guy? The list? Yeah, of course. Inspect element with. I just open a Firebug because Firefox's default is a little dark. So here is li, 3 list items, right, for each to do. Are you looking for something?
I just wanted
to. Okay, yeah. All right, tell you what. It's 3 o'clock. Let's take a 15-minute break, go get some coffee. I don't know how many of you plan to come back, but for those who are coming back, adding new to-dos, filtering, factories and services, Ajax, all coming up in 15 minutes. See you soon. Thank you for coming in. Oh, thank you.